The night I secretly heard again was the night I realized the woman beside me was waiting for me to die, and the realization did not arrive like thunder, but like a slow, cold blade sliding beneath my skin. As I lay motionless in the dark, with Madison breathing softly beside me, believing I was trapped forever in silence, while the world whispered its truths without mercy, just beyond my closed eyes. I should not have been able to hear. That night, the doctors said my recovery would be slow and unstable, that most sound would come only as distortion and shadow. Yet when Madison slipped from the bed and answered her phone in the hallway, her voice cut through the darkness with a clarity so terrifying, it stole the air from my lungs. She spoke my name with irritation, not fear, not concern, but annoyance, as if my existence itself had become an obstacle. She was forced to tolerate, and then she laughed softly and told the man on the other end of the line that everything was nearly settled, that after the wedding the assets would finally be secure, and that even if something unfortunate happened to me, suddenly the transfer would be clean and irreversible. I remember gripping the sheets as she spoke the word passes with careless ease, as if she were discussing weather and not my life. And in that moment, the walls of my world began to collapse inward without a sound. She lowered her voice then and said that the contracts were ready, the votes were aligned, and that I was no longer a man, but a liability, a fortune waiting to be unlocked by my absence. And as she ended the call with a soft, satisfied hum, I lay frozen in the dark, listening to the woman I was meant to marry, casually assign value to my death. I wanted to scream, I wanted to rise and confront her, but the instinct that had once built empires forced me into stillness, because something far more dangerous than heartbreak was unfolding, and I needed to hear every word of it. When she returned to the bedroom, she brushed my cheek with a tenderness so false, it burned, and whispered that I should rest, that tomorrow would be another long day for us. And she did not know that the word us no longer included trust or safety or love. Minutes later, soft footsteps moved through the hallway again, and this time they did not carry calculation or contempt. They carried hesitation and fear and gentle care, and when the door opened quietly, Claire slipped into the room with a cloth in her trembling hand and a bowl of warm water held tightly against her chest. She knelt beside the bed and lifted my hand with the reverence one might offer a fragile thing, not a powerful man broken by circumstance, and she began to clean the faint smear of dried blood where I had reopened the stitches in my sleep. Her touch was light, her breath uneven, as if she were trying too hard not to disturb me, and in the dim light, her eyes shimmered with unspoken worry that had nothing to do with money or contracts or futures measured in shares. When she finished, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and closed my fingers around it with quiet urgency, and her lips moved in a silent message she did not know I could suddenly hear echo within me. I waited until her footsteps faded before opening the paper with shaking hands, and in careful, imperfect letters it read, "If you ever hear again, I hope you hear the truth," and I felt something crack deep inside my chest. 2 women stood in my life that night, and neither realized how close their words now stood. Beside each other, one had calculated the profit of my death, while the other had prayed for the survival of my soul. I understood then, with terrifying clarity, the stakes that had formed around me like invisible steel walls. For if Madison discovered I could hear again, I would lose control of my company before sunrise and become nothing more than a discarded liability. If Claire was seen as more than a servant, she would be erased quietly from this house, and I would never know what became of her. And if Madison succeeded fully, I would be forced from the empire I had built with my own hands, and silenced more completely than I ever was by my injury. The power I once commanded now balanced on the fragile edge of my continued silence, and the truth hid behind every whisper I pretended not to hear. As Madison slipped back into bed satisfied and unafraid, and Claire vanished into the shadows carrying nothing but a small hope on folded paper, I lay between them, suspended in a world that believed me broken, unaware that the most dangerous thing in the room was no longer my deafness, but my ability to listen. That night I did not sleep because love and betrayal had both spoken their first true words to me, and I knew with absolute certainty that by the time this story ended, only one of them would survive. The night I secretly heard again was the night I realized the woman beside me was waiting for me to die, and the realization did not arrive like thunder, but like a slow, cold blade sliding beneath my skin as I lay motionless in the dark with Madison breathing softly beside me, believing I was trapped forever in silence, while the world whispered its truths without mercy just beyond my closed eyes. I should not have been able to hear. That night the doctors said my recovery would be slow and unstable, that most sound would come only as distortion and shadow. Yet when Madison slipped from the bed and answered her phone in the hallway, her voice cut through the darkness with a clarity so terrifying it stole the air from my lungs. She spoke my name with irritation, not fear, not concern, but annoyance, as if my existence itself had become an obstacle she was forced to tolerate. And then she laughed softly and told the man on the other end of the line that everything was nearly settled, that after the wedding the assets would finally be secure, and that even if something unfortunate happened to me, suddenly the transfer would be clean and irreversible. I remember gripping the sheets as she spoke. The word passes with careless ease, as if she were discussing weather and not my life. And in that moment, the walls of my world began to collapse inward without a sound. She lowered her voice then and said that the contracts were ready, the votes were aligned, and that I was no longer a man, but a liability, a fortune waiting to be unlocked by my absence. And as she ended the call with a soft, satisfied hum, I lay frozen in the dark, listening to the woman I was meant to marry, casually assign value to my death. I wanted to scream, I wanted to rise and confront her, but the instinct that had once built empires forced me into stillness, because something far more dangerous than heartbreak was unfolding, and I needed to hear every word of it. When she returned to the bedroom, she brushed my cheek with a tenderness so false it burned, and whispered that I should rest, that tomorrow would be another long day for us. And she did not know that the word us no longer included trust or safety or love. Minutes later, soft footsteps moved through the hallway again, and this time they did not carry calculation or contempt. They carried hesitation and fear and gentle care, and when the door opened quietly, Claire slipped into the room with a cloth in her trembling hand and a bowl of warm water held tightly against her chest. She knelt beside the bed and lifted my hand with the reverence one might offer a fragile thing, not a powerful man broken by circumstance, and she began, to clean the faint smear of dried blood where I had reopened the stitches in my sleep. Her touch was light, her breath uneven, as if she were trying too hard not to disturb me, and in the dim light, her eyes shimmered with unspoken worry that had nothing to do with money or contracts, or futures measured in shares. When she finished, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and closed my fingers around it with quiet urgency, and her lips moved in a silent message she did not know I could suddenly hear echo within me. I waited until her footsteps faded before opening the paper with shaking hands, and in careful imperfect letters it read, "If you ever hear again, I hope you hear the truth," and I felt something crack deep inside my chest. 2 women stood in my life that night, and neither realized how close their words now stood beside each other. One had calculated the profit of my death, while the other had prayed for the survival of my soul. I understood then, with terrifying clarity, the stakes that had formed around me like invisible steel walls. For if Madison discovered I could hear again, I would lose control of my company before sunrise and become nothing more than a discarded liability. If Claire was seen as more than a servant, she would be erased quietly from this house, and I would never know what became of her. And if Madison succeeded fully, I would be forced from the empire I had built with my own hands, and silenced more completely than I ever was by my injury. The power I once commanded now balanced on the fragile edge of my continued silence, and the truth hid behind every whisper I pretended not to hear. As Madison slipped back into bed, satisfied and unafraid, and Claire vanished into the shadows, carrying nothing but a small hope on folded paper, I lay between them, suspended in a world that believed me broken, unaware that the most dangerous thing in the room was no longer my deafness, but my ability to listen. That night, I did not sleep because love and betrayal had both spoken their first true words to me, and I knew with absolute certainty that by the time this story ended, only one of them would survive. Before the blast, the night still felt ordinary, with rain tapping softly on the windshield as I left the gala with applause lingering in my ears and pride heavy in my chest. The driver guided the car through midtown traffic while my phone continued to vibrate with messages of congratulations from investors and politicians who wanted to share in the afterglow of the contract I had just secured. Madison sat beside me, scrolling through photos from the event, already crafting the narrative she would release to the press by morning. And I remember thinking, with absent satisfaction, that everything in my life still moved exactly as planned. The city lights stretched endlessly ahead of us, and the road felt like a ribbon of familiar promise, pulling me forward into the future I believed I controlled. The driver slowed briefly at the entrance to the private parking structure beneath my tower, and I glanced up at the steel ceiling of the ramp without any sense of unease, because danger had never been part of my daily rituals. The descent into the garage was smooth at first, and then there was a fraction of a second where the air itself seemed to tighten as if the world drew a breath. It never released the explosion, arrived without warning and without sound, at least not at first, only a violent force that lifted the car from beneath us and tore metal apart like paper. The impact threw my body forward and sideways as glass shattered and folded inward, and the world became pure motion without direction or meaning. The last clear image I remember was Madison screaming as the dashboard bloomed with sparks and white light swallowed everything. When awareness returned, it came in fragments of heat and pressure and darkness, pressing against my eyes as if the air itself had turned solid around me. I tried to move, but my body responded with nothing but distant numbness, and my mouth opened in what I assumed was a scream. Yet I heard absolutely nothing, not the wail of sirens, not the shouts of men, not even my own voice clawing its way through panic. I floated in that silence as hands pulled me from twisted metal and laid me onto a hard surface, where shadows moved above me with frantic urgency. The absence of sound was more terrifying than the pain, because it felt like the universe itself had been switched off, leaving me sealed inside a glass coffin with only my terror for company. At the hospital, lights burned above me in a sterile blur. As surgeons moved with precision I could not hear, and mouths formed words I could not understand. My chest convulsed as I fought to breathe, and every attempt to speak returned only as pressure without sound, as if my lungs had forgotten how to reach the world. When I finally woke again hours later, Madison was beside the bed, her eyes red with tears that might have been grief or shock or something. I did not yet know how to read. The doctor stood behind her, explaining something with slow, careful movements that were meant to be comforting, but meant nothing to me, because all I could see were lips shaping meaning I could not hear. I searched their faces for reassurance, but found only measured restraint and the steady gravity of people delivering news no one ever wants to give. When Madison covered her mouth and collapsed into the chair beside me, I understood the truth before the words ever reached me, and the silence pressed even harder against my skull, with the weight of a sentence that would follow me for the rest of my life. My hearing was gone, they wrote on a tablet, with clinical precision, the words neat and merciless and final, and I watched as my future closed inward like a door I had never imagined losing the power to open. The days that followed blurred into a pattern of confusion and static frustration as the world continued to move in visible motion, while remaining acoustically distant and unreachable to me. Machines beeped without sound, nurses spoke without voices, and Madison cried without the comfort or the cruelty of tone. I learned to read lips with exhausted concentration, but the effort drained me, and the gulf between what was said and what I could understand widened into a constant ache. Specialists came and went, bringing scans and tests that painted images of damage, along my auditory nerves and pathology reports that used words like severe and permanent. With quiet certainty, Madison stayed at my side in those early days, answering questions for me, signing documents on my behalf, and managing the chaos that unfolded across my company, while I remained trapped in a bed that felt suddenly smaller than any prison. The board called in emergency sessions, attorneys filled my calendar, and every decision that once moved through my voice now required layers of mediation and delay. I watched from a distance as control slipped gently out of my hands and into the careful grip of my fiancé, who assured everyone that she would protect my interests, while I recovered each signature she placed in my absence. Felt like a stitch binding me tighter to a future I no longer directed. The night terrors began, soon after flashes of light and pressure, jolting me awake with my heart racing, as if the blast itself still echoed inside my bones. Even though the world remained mute, I learned the language of vibration. Instead, the hum of machines through the mattress, the tremor of footsteps through the floor, and the subtle quake of doors closing somewhere beyond my vision. Madison slept beside me, but I sensed her withdrawal in the distance of her touch, and the impatience that crept into the tightness of her jaw when I failed to understand quickly enough. I could not hear the sighs, but I could see them in the rise and fall of her shoulders and in the way her eyes flicked away. When I asked for things twice, doctors spoke of possible future procedures, but their optimism was measured and cautious, and always cloaked in probability rather than promise. Each appointment ended the same way, with my hopes lifted slightly and then set carefully back on the ground like something too fragile to be trusted. In my hands, the media swarmed outside the hospital, speculating about the attack and about my future and about what it meant for the defense contracts tied so tightly to my name. Madison managed every statement and filtered every message I received, telling me what I needed to know and gently omitting the rest. I told myself that this was care, that this was loyalty, that this was exactly what a woman in her position should do. But the silence inside me made room for doubts that had never lived there before. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, the city I had once commanded greeted me without sound, and without the warmth I remembered. The penthouse felt enormous and empty, as if the walls had retreated while I was away, and Madison moved through it with purposeful efficiency, giving orders to staff and adjusting routines to accommodate the man I had become. Without ever quite looking at me the way she used to, that was when Claire formally entered my daily life, not as a dramatic figure, but as a quiet, constant, delivering meals and arranging medication, and moving with a gentleness that never startled me. I did not yet understand how profoundly the blast had reshaped every role in my world, but I felt it in the way authority shifted from voice to signature and from will to permission. The bomb had not only taken my hearing, it had taken the simple certainty with which I once moved through life and replaced it with a hollow space filled with dependence and doubt, and the unsettling suspicion that the empire I had commanded might already be learning how to function without me at its center. Madison did not leave after the explosion, and the doctors praised her loyalty with soft admiration, as if endurance alone were proof of love, and for a time I believed it too, because she remained beside my bed through the first weeks of confusion and shock, answering questions before I could read the lips that formed them, and signing papers with swift confidence that reassured everyone watching that the empire of Julian Cross was still securely guided. She arranged my schedule, met with attorneys, coordinated with the board, and spoke on my behalf with a calm authority that felt almost impressive in those early days when I was still drowning inside the weight of my new silence. Yet whenever the room emptied, and it was only the two of us, I saw the cost of that devotion written in tightly controlled impatience in the corners of her eyes and in the stiff precision of her movements, as if she were performing a duty rather than standing beside a man she loved. The first time I sensed the fracture clearly was when she pushed a document toward me at the dining table and insisted through sharp gestures that I sign it immediately before I could fully read the terms. When I hesitated, her jaw tightened and she forced a brittle smile that failed to reach her eyes and pointed again to the signature line with quick, irritated movements that carried no trace of tenderness. The paper transferred temporary executive authority to her in the case of medical incapacity, and though the wording appeared standard, the urgency of her demand felt strangely disproportionate, as if delay itself posed a threat to something she was racing to secure. From that day forward, the requests multiplied steadily, each one framed as a necessity for my protection, yet each one quietly reducing my reach inside the company I had built. She blamed the board for the pressure, she blamed the lawyers, she blamed the market, but never once did she acknowledge the way control shifted toward her hands with every new signature I placed under her watchful gaze. At night, when she lay beside me, she turned her back more often than she faced me, and the warmth that once lived between us cooled into ceremonial obligation, measured in routine touches and dutiful appearances for the cameras. I learned to read frustration in the roll of her shoulders when I struggled to understand, and in the tight exhale that followed each repeated explanation, I demanded through clumsy notes and laborious questions. The silence inside me magnified every visual cue until her disdain grew impossible to ignore, even without sound. I watched as she began retreating from the room to take calls that once would have happened openly at my side, and when she returned, her expression carried the self-satisfied edge of private victories I was no longer invited to share. She wore new dresses that glittered beneath the lights at political fundraisers she attended alone now, while I remained confined to recovery rooms and guarded hallways framed by security and staff who spoke to me as gently as one might address a fragile object rather than a living partner. Even the way she looked at me changed, as if she were already evaluating how expensive this version of me would become before she decided whether it was worth the investment. The doctors spoke of potential future procedures, but Madison spoke only of outcomes measured in margins and risk and timing. And when I tried to ask through writing whether she was afraid for me, she responded with a brief nod and then immediately redirected the conversation toward quarterly projections and pending mergers that required her careful attention. I began to realize that she spoke of my condition only as it related to what it delayed or jeopardized, never as something that wounded me. She stayed, but she did not soften, and that distinction slowly carved itself into my heart with quiet precision. Staff members avoided my gaze when Madison was present, and I sensed their discomfort in the lowered eyes and the stiff deference with which they followed her instructions, as if my presence had already become secondary in my own home. On more than one occasion, I watched her dismiss my written requests with an absent flick of her wrist when she was engaged with her phone, whispering to someone behind a closed door, while I waited seated like a child outside a room that no longer included me. The contempt grew subtle, at first hidden beneath efficiency, but it sharpened with each day that passed without my full recovery. When I struggled in public, she would lean close and smile for the cameras while gripping my arm, too tightly beneath her perfect composure, and I learned that even without sound pain still found its way into every silence. I sensed her resentment in the way she inspected the lines of my face for weakness, and in the way she studied my hands when they shook with effort, as if calculating what I had become and how far that fell from the man she had chosen. At night, when she believed I slept, she scrolled through her phone with quick, impatient movements, and the soft glow lit her expression with a hunger that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with appetite. I saw her studying documents marked with high stakes and unfamiliar accounts, glimpsing the outlines of transactions that did not feel protective or gentle, but aggressive and opportunistic in their intent. The woman who stayed beside my bed wore the face of devotion for the world, yet the woman who moved through my life when she thought I could not perceive her measured time money and leverage with a meticulous focus that left little room for compassion. Slowly and without ceremony, I began to understand that she had not stayed to love me. She had stayed to count what remained to be claimed from the ruins of the man I was becoming. The first time I truly noticed Claire was not when she entered the house, but when she hesitated at the threshold of the room, as if sensing the invisible gravity of my presence, before I ever looked up from the page I pretended to read. And in that pause, there was no fear, only care measured and quiet. Like a prayer formed without sound, she did not rush me, she did not stare, and she did not perform kindness for approval, but instead moved with the steady rhythm of someone who expected nothing in return for decency given. When she set the tray beside me, her hands trembled just enough to reveal how seriously she took even the smallest task, and then she stepped back to wait for my signal, as if I were not broken, but simply thinking. Claire never spoke to me the way Madison did, with clipped urgency and visible irritation, and she never filled the silence with uncomfortable explanations or forced smiles meant to prove patience for show. Instead, she communicated with deliberate simplicity, sliding small notes across the table and holding my gaze just long enough to be sure I understood before stepping away. Her handwriting was careful and rounded, and each word felt chosen with tenderness rather than speed. And for the first time since the blast, I felt seen without being evaluated. It was impossible not to notice that she never once asked about my company, my shares, my influence, or the future that everyone else seemed desperate to shape around me. She asked only whether I had slept, whether the light hurt my eyes, and whether my hands were steady enough to hold a cup without pain. In a house measured by value clauses and surveillance feeds, her attention belonged only to the quiet, private geography of my daily survival. The first accidental touch happened one evening as she reached to steady the glass. I nearly dropped, and our fingers brushed for half a second. No longer than a breath, yet the contact sent a shock through my chest, more profound than any sensation I had felt since the explosion. She pulled back instantly, flushed and flustered, and bowed her head in apology, as if she had crossed some unforgivable boundary, while I remained strangely frozen by the warmth that lingered on my skin long after her hand retreated. The contact unsettled me because it carried no transaction, no agenda, no calculation, and it terrified me because I realized how starved I had become for touch that did not cost me control. After that moment, I began noticing everything about her, the way her shoulders tensed when voices rose, nearby the way she flinched when a door slammed too hard, the way she folded inward when Madison entered the room with her sharp movements and cold authority. Claire moved through the penthouse like a shadow of empathy, absorbing tension without feeding on it, and when she thought no one watched, she pressed her palm against her chest, as if reminding herself to keep breathing. One night, as I pretended to sleep, I heard the faintest sound, not through ears that still betrayed me, but through the low vibration of a quiet sob passing through the air, just enough for my partial returning sense to catch. I followed the sound down the hallway, with slow, careful steps, afraid to disturb whatever fragile moment unfolded behind the closed door. And there in the small service corridor, I saw Claire seated on the floor, with her knees drawn close, her face buried against her arms. As tears slipped free from the control she carried so carefully during the day, in her trembling shape, I saw not weakness, but exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding pain too long without permission to release it. And without thinking, I took a step closer, the floor betraying me, with a soft creak that made her lift her head in startled fear. When she saw me, she scrambled to her feet, wiping her face in shame, as if sorrow were something she had failed to hide properly. And she shook her head in silent apology, retreating before I could move nearer still. The next morning she would not meet my eyes, and the careful notes she slid across the table carried an added politeness, as if distance might protect me from something raw she feared I should not witness. From that night on, I listened more closely to the spaces she thought belonged only to her, and one evening I heard her whisper to herself in the laundry room words meant for someone far away and long gone, as she spoke of how tired she was and how she wished her father were still alive to tell her she had survived enough already. It was the first time I learned about the firefighter who had never come home, about the mother buried beneath hospital debt, and about the little brother who waited for textbooks and bus fare that never quite arrived on time. She never asked me for anything, and yet the weight of her unspoken story pressed against my chest, heavier than any contract or threat I had faced. In the quiet minutes when Madison vanished into phone calls and closed doors, Claire remained near, always within sight, yet never intruding, and for the first time since the blast, I stopped feeling like an asset stored between transactions and began feeling like a man allowed to exist without leverage. Each note she wrote carried not instruction, but invitation, letting me decide even the smallest matters for myself again. And when I struggled, she waited without visible frustration, as if time itself were finally permitted to bend around my limitations. I began leaving notes for her in return, simple words of thanks and awkward attempts at humor that made her smile shyly before she quickly hid it, and the warmth of that exchanged silence grew into something fragile and essential. I realized one afternoon, as she knelt to adjust the brace on my leg, that she had never once looked toward the skyline of power that defined my life, and that her gaze never strayed toward the symbols of wealth that crowded every corner of the room. Her eyes always returned to my face, searching not for what I owned, but for what I felt, and in that realization, I understood with sudden clarity that Claire Monroe was the only person in this house who had never measured me by the value of my name. The first sound returned to me, like a ghost brushing past, the edge of reality so faint I almost believed my mind had fabricated it out of desperation. As I sat alone in the silent exam room, watching the doctor's lips move with careful optimism, while a low, distant vibration shivered somewhere deep inside my skull. At first, it felt like pressure rather than sound, a subtle tremor that did not yet carry meaning, but carried possibility. And when the doctor adjusted the device and asked me to focus, I felt it again, stronger this time. A broken echo of his voice, reaching me through water and walls and damage I had been told would never heal. My chest tightened and my hands began to shake, not from fear but from the unbearable weight of hope I had trained myself not to expect. The procedure that followed was slow and invasive, and left my head ringing with distorted pulses that blurred into one another without shape. Yet with each passing day, the noise began to sharpen into fragments that resembled truth. A door closed down the hall, and for the first time since the blast, I perceived the existence of that closure, not through vibration, but through sound thin and fragile, yet unmistakably real. I did not tell Madison, and I did not tell the board, and I did not even tell Claire. Because the moment awareness returned, it brought with it a terrible instinct that whispered, "Listen, before you trust, reveal nothing yet." The doctor warned me that recovery would be partial and unpredictable, that some days I might hear shadows and others nothing at all. And I accepted those limits, not with disappointment, but with strategy, because even fragments were enough to change everything if used carefully. At home, the world still moved as if I were sealed away from it. Madison spoke and gestured and orchestrated my days. With the same controlled impatience she had perfected in my absence, and staff members continued their routines under the false assumption that I remained locked permanently in silence. Only I knew that the silence had begun to fracture, and through those fractures the truth was waiting. At first I listened by accident, catching stray syllables and half-formed words when Madison stood too close, or when the doors were left ajar, and the thrill of those moments frightened me with their power. Information returned not as privilege, but as weapon and shield at the same time, and I realized quickly that if Madison discovered the change before I understood the full scope of her intentions, I would lose the most valuable advantage I had possessed since the explosion. So I chose to pretend longer and deeper than I ever had before, because pretending was no longer a mask of weakness, but the only way to survive the game that had already begun without my consent. I nodded when I did not understand and exaggerated confusion, when the sound sharpened too clearly, and I let Madison believe that the man she controlled remained safely trapped in dependency, while I quietly learned how to listen again in fragments and shadows. The first full sentence I heard changed the way my blood moved. It came late one evening when Madison stood at the window, speaking into her phone with her back to me, believing the distance between us secured her privacy, and her voice reached me in uneven pieces. At first, before assembling itself into meaning that made my lungs forget how to draw air. She spoke of timelines and leverage, and votes she spoke of my condition as obstacle rather than tragedy, and she spoke of the board as if they were already aligned in a future she had built without me at its center. The weight of that knowledge nearly crushed the discipline I forced upon myself, and still I remained motionless in my chair, pretending to read a document I no longer needed, because for the first time in months I could hear the threat forming around me in real time. Each day after that, my control over sound expanded slightly, and with it my understanding of the quiet war Madison had begun to wage beneath the surface of my recovery. I heard the impatience in her tone when she spoke to lawyers, and the thinly veiled contempt when she referred to me as unfit and unstable, and the satisfied calm when she talked about transfer clauses that would activate with frightening finality. The more I heard, the more dangerous my silence became, and yet I maintained it with deliberate care because I needed proof, not suspicion, and precision, not impulse. Through it all, Claire remained unchanged in her careful kindness, unaware that my world had shifted beneath her feet as well, and every gentle note she passed to me now carried a double truth, the words I could read and the voice I could suddenly hear in memory, when she had whispered softly to herself, believing I lived beyond the reach of sound. One evening, when she thought the laundry room empty, she spoke my name in a quiet breath so soft it nearly vanished as it formed, and that single syllable struck deeper than any declaration ever had, because it was unguarded and meant for no audience but her own heart. I stood on the other side of the door, frozen by the intimacy of a truth I was never meant to witness, and I understood then that my secret hearing had not only returned me to the world, it had made me its most invisible witness. I listened as she apologized to a memory of her father for feeling afraid again, and as she promised her brother that she would send more money soon, and as she confessed to the dark that she cared too much for a man who could not hear her, and that caring for him hurt more than she could admit. I leaned against the wall that night, fighting the urge to step forward and reveal everything, because the cost of that truth would have been unbearable for her if I moved too soon. Madison continued tightening her net day by day, and the board pressed closer to formal decisions masked as medical contingency. And through it all, I learned to measure my steps not by sound alone, but by the danger attached to each truth I uncovered. The miracle had returned my hearing, but it had also returned my vulnerability, and until I fully understood who stood in the light and who within shadow, I could trust no one completely, not even the woman whose notes had once been my only lifeline. So I hid the miracle behind deliberate weakness and allowed the world to believe that Julian Cross remained deaf and dependent, while in the silence I had chosen, I began preparing for the moment when pretending would no longer protect me, and the truth would finally demand to be heard. I began to hear Madison most clearly when she believed I was at my weakest because confidence made her careless, and weakness made her bold. And every morning as I sat in the study, pretending to struggle through documents I did not need, she moved through the house, speaking freely into her phone with the controlled ambition of someone who no longer feared consequences. Her conversations unfolded in layers, at first vague references to timing and pressure, and then sharper edges that revealed intent, as she discussed blocks of shares quietly shifting hands through intermediaries whose names meant nothing to her emotions, but everything to the future of my company. She spoke about liquidity and alignment and exit strategies, with the calm detachment of a surgeon describing an operation, as if my empire were already laid open, on the table ready for extraction. And when one of her contacts questioned the legality of such movements, she dismissed the concern with an airy note of confidence, saying the paperwork would be clean because incapacity changed everything, and silence made even the strongest man invisible. For the first time since the blast rage did not strike me in a wave, but crept slowly through my veins like poison that knew exactly where to settle. By the second week, the fragments became patterns as I heard her rehearse arguments in front of mirrors and refine narratives over wine with allies who entered the house through side doors and departed without ever meeting my eyes, as if my presence were already ceremonial rather than real. She referred to me as unstable, not with malice, but with certainty, as if the word were already stamped into my identity by precedent and permission, and she spoke of the board as a set of obstacles she could navigate through pressure promises and quiet threats disguised as opportunity. Each conversation revealed another stitch in the legal net she was weaving around me, which would allow her to sideline my authority under the guise of compassion and concern. I learned that she had already secured provisional support from 2 major shareholders through projected growth models that excluded my involvement and placed her as the visible architect of a cleaner, more stable future for cross industries, free from the uncertainty of a damaged founder. The cruelty of it did not arrive through insults, but through calm efficiency, as she promised them continuity and profit in the absence of the man who had built everything they now sought to protect. One afternoon, I heard her voice sharpen when she spoke to an attorney about emergency succession language that would activate if my condition failed to improve by a specific date. And when the man hesitated, she reminded him softly that delay favored no one and that promises once broken had a way of ending careers. In those moments, my hands shook not with fear, but with the knowledge that I was listening to my own replacement being installed piece by piece, without ceremony and without resistance. The worst realization came when she began discussing potential candidates for the role I once occupied with analytical curiosity, as if reviewing applicants rather than plotting the removal of the man she claimed to love. Names surfaced paired with credentials and political leverage and media appeal, and I listened as she weighed optics against stability and loyalty against convenience with a cruelty that disguised itself as pragmatism. At night, when she returned to the bedroom, she performed tenderness with studied precision, laying her hand against my chest to feel the rise and fall of breath she now viewed as a temporary inconvenience rather than a shared miracle. I learned to keep my face still as truth poured into me in pieces that cut more cleanly than any blade, because they were delivered without hatred, only calculation. On the 3rd week, I heard her speak to a private investigator about confirming my movements within the house and verifying whether I had any external contact that might disrupt the strategy, and when she laughed lightly and said that I was harmless, now that investigation ended any lingering hope that my safety still mattered to her at all. She spoke openly of the value of containment and isolation, and of how easily allies shifted when incentives aligned. And I realized that the empire I had built on trust and intimidation was now being repurposed against me with equal efficiency. The betrayal reached its deepest point the evening she told a confidant that if I had truly loved her, I would have had the decency to die and liberate both of us from the inconvenience of my survival. And those words landed with such quiet finality that for a moment I believed the partial hearing that delivered them was a gift given only to ensure I felt their full weight. I sat motionless as she spoke about compensation clauses and sympathetic statements that would follow the announcement of my permanent removal from leadership, and the media angles already prepared to frame her as the devoted partner forced into reluctant command by tragedy. The performance was almost elegant in its thoroughness, and I understood then that this was not a sudden shift born of fear, but a plan that had merely waited for an opening my misfortune had provided. Every choice she described positioned her as protector while stripping me of agency until I would become a living symbol rather than a decision-maker trapped within the company that once answered to my voice. The most chilling part was not the ambition, but the absence of conflict in her tone as she walked through the steps that would quietly erase me from relevance and reposition my life as collateral damage in a larger campaign for power. When she finally ended the call, she glanced in my direction with an expression that softened into practiced concern and asked through careful gestures whether I was tired and needed to rest. And in that moment, I saw the full divide between what the world believed and what she believed she had secured. The silence I had once feared now became my shelter, because if I spoke, she would simply accelerate and close what distance remained between my authority and my extinction. I learned that survival would demand patience sharper than any weapon I had ever wielded, and that delay would no longer be weakness, but preparation. That night, as she slept peacefully beside me, confident in the architecture she had constructed, I lay awake, listening to the echo of her intentions settle into certainty within my bones, and I understood that Madison Vale did not merely want control of my empire, but wanted me gone from the future she had already begun to inhabit alone. While Madison spoke in schemes and removals, Claire spoke only to the quiet spaces of the house and to the memories she believed no one else could hear, and it was in those moments that I learned what love sounded like, when it had no expectations and no audience, and no promise of being returned. I began to linger near doorways and behind walls, not to spy, but because her voice carried something my fractured world needed more than oxygen. And one night, as rain traced slow, trembling lines down the windows, I heard her in the small utility room whispering to her father as if he still lived somewhere beyond the reach of tragedy, telling him that she was trying to be brave and that she was learning how to stand in rooms filled with power without letting it crush the small, fragile part of her that still believed kindness mattered. She spoke of my silence as if it were a living presence between us, saying softly that she wished I could hear how often she prayed for me, how often she asked the dark to be gentle with me, and how much it hurt to care for someone who might never know the sound of her voice. I stood frozen in the corridor while her words wrapped around me with terrifying tenderness, and I realized that everything Madison had stripped from me, Claire was quietly restoring without ever intending to claim anything in return. Days later, I heard her speaking with a man in the kitchen, an old friend from the neighborhood who had come to deliver groceries for her mother, and his voice carried open interest mixed with concern as he told her she deserved more than a life of shadows and quiet servitude. He asked if she would consider leaving this job and starting anew, and the hope in his question was undeniable. And for the first time since my hearing returned, I felt fear not of betrayal, but of loss sharp and sudden, as if someone had placed a blade against my heart without warning. Claire answered him gently, with a sadness that carried no regret, and said that she could not go because her heart was already somewhere it could never belong. And when he asked who, she did not speak my name, but her silence spoke it with devastating clarity. Later that night, when the house slept, I heard her weeping by the window, not in loud, broken sobs, but in restrained breaths that trembled under their own weight, as she pressed her forehead to the glass and whispered the words that finally undone me. I fell in love with a man who cannot hear me, and now I must love him in a language he will never know. In that moment, the distance between what I was and what I pretended to be became unbearable, and I sank against the wall, struggling to remain silent while something inside me shattered with a sound no one else could hear. I wanted to step forward and reveal every truth, but I saw then how fragile her courage was, and how deeply she relied on the illusion of my unawareness to protect herself from the humiliation of unreturned feeling. To speak then would have been to steal from her the gentle dignity she had preserved in her secrecy, and so I chose again to remain silent, even as every instinct screamed to reach for her. The days that followed grew heavier with unspoken emotion that clung to every shared space between us, and each time her hands brushed mine, or she adjusted a sleeve or steadied a cup, my body reacted as if struck by lightning, and I was forced to remember that she still believed me deaf to everything she carried alone. She began leaving smaller notes now, as if afraid to say too much even on paper, and I answered with fewer words than before, because every exchange brought me closer to a truth I could not yet claim without destroying the delicate balance that kept her near. One afternoon, as she folded fresh linens at the foot of my bed, she spoke softly without looking at me, confessing in the same neutral tone one might use to describe the weather that a man had asked her to marry him that morning, and had offered her safety and help for her family, and a future she could touch with her hands, and still she had said no. I felt my chest seize as she explained that she could not promise her heart to anyone when it was already bound to someone unreachable, and she laughed faintly at herself for loving without permission or hope. I wanted to shout that she was not loving alone, that every breath she spoke I carried within me, that every word she believed lost to silence lived inside my blood now, but my body obeyed the rules of the danger that surrounded us. And I remained still while she finished her story and quietly apologized to me for being distracted, as if her suffering were an inconvenience I deserved explanation for. When she left the room that day, I did not move for a long time, because I had just heard the purest truth of devotion I had ever known, and I was powerless to answer it without placing her directly in the path of the woman who wanted me erased. That night, I cried without sound for the first time since the explosion, because the miracle that restored my hearing had also forced me to listen to a love I could not yet protect without destroying it. In the silence of that grief, I understood with devastating certainty that Madison wanted me gone from the future, but Claire wanted me to live within it, even if she never stood beside me as more than the quiet shadow who loved me from a distance, and that knowledge bound me to her more completely than any vow ever could. The invitation arrived wrapped in elegance and obligation. A private gala announced as a celebration of resilience and leadership, held beneath crystal light in a restored Manhattan mansion, borrowed from a donor who owed Madison several quiet favors, and the purpose presented to the world was my recovery and the future of Cross Industries. But beneath the silk and champagne, I could already hear the machinery of removal aligning itself with ruthless patience. Madison dressed me herself that night, fastening my jacket with hands that trembled not from nerves but from anticipation, and she smiled with convincing warmth for the mirrors and cameras, as if she were guiding a beloved partner into the night, while in truth she was leading a condemned man toward his verdict. The guests arrived in waves: financial titans, political allies, generals, foreign investors, and the board members whose loyalties had already begun to tilt beneath promises and pressure. and I felt the room hum with cautious evaluation as every eye took inventory of the man I had become. Madison moved through the crowd with deceptive grace, gathering smiles and sealing quiet deals with glances and nods that told me she felt victory approaching with measured certainty. Claire remained against the perimeter, dressed in a simple uniform that did nothing to conceal the tension held in her shoulders, as if she sensed the danger in the air without understanding its shape. And when our eyes met across the room, the fear that moved through her was unmistakable, though she masked it behind professional composure. The first blow fell when Madison guided me to the center of the room beneath a towering chandelier and gestured for attention with a glass raised high while I stood beside her playing the role of the broken partner, whose presence served only as emotional weight for her performance. She spoke of courage and survival and the burden of leadership carried through crisis, and the crowd rewarded her with applause that sounded like approval for her ascension, rather than gratitude for my endurance. Then she unveiled the next step with calculated tenderness, announcing the need for a temporary restructuring to protect the company in light of my condition. And when the documents appeared in the hands of waiting aides, I saw the future she had prepared unfold with clinical precision. One by one, the board members stepped forward to place their signatures beneath the pretense of necessity, while the guests murmured with rehearsed sympathy, and the press scribbled narratives shaped by words Madison had already fed them. I remained at the center of it all, silent by expectation and assumption, the embodiment of a founder reduced to figurehead, ready to be folded neatly from relevance. Claire watched from the edge, frozen as the room shifted around her, and I saw the moment she realized something irreversible was happening, as panic flickered across her face with the clarity of instinct. It was then that Madison turned her attention toward Claire, not with overt cruelty, but with the cold satisfaction of someone clearing debris from a clean path, and she summoned her forward with a gesture that carried command rather than request. As Claire stepped into the light, Madison's voice sharpened with polite disdain as she spoke of loyalty and boundaries and the importance of knowing one's place within a world of ranks and influence. And then with surgical precision, she exposed Claire as an inappropriate emotional presence, accusing her of exploiting my condition for affection and advantage. The words struck like a public verdict, and the room responded with collective discomfort, as if witnessing something forbidden yet sanctioned. Claire stood trembling under that gaze, her fear no longer concealed, and when she attempted to defend herself, through halting explanation, Madison interrupted with a sharper tone that silenced her completely. The humiliation was deliberate, not impulsive, and designed to sever whatever connection the audience might have imagined between us, by painting her as a servant who had forgotten the distance her position required. I felt the rage rise in me like a living force straining against the silence I had chosen, but I remained still because the final act of Madison's design had not yet completed its arc, and I needed the trap fully exposed before I destroyed it. The last paper was placed before me with theatrical sympathy, and Madison leaned close, whispering that this was for my own protection, that it was only for a while, that I would still be honored, safely removed from pressure and expectation. And I saw in her eyes the glint of triumph she could no longer fully conceal. The room waited, the press leaned forward, and the board held their breath for my signature. the symbol that would complete my erasure under the polite cover of mercy. Claire stood motionless near the wall, her hands clenched at her sides, tears burning without permission, and in that silent communion between us, I saw the question in her eyes, whether I would allow this to happen, whether I would let the world take me from her without ever hearing the truth she had carried in hidden devotion. Madison was certain that night that I could not stop what she had set into motion, because deaf men did not interrupt history and broken founders did not reclaim thrones. She believed the trap had closed completely because she had constructed it with flawless timing, legal authority, and public spectacle. And in that belief she stood certain that Julian Cross would vanish quietly beneath her ascent. What she did not yet understand was that every word she had spoken that night, every lie, every calculated mercy, and every humiliation inflicted upon the woman who loved me in secret, had been heard with brutal clarity, and the silence she relied upon no longer belonged to her. The room waited for my signature as if history itself were holding its breath, and Madison stood beside me, with her hand poised just close enough to guide my fingers. If I hesitated too long, her smile composed for the cameras while her eyes warned me that the moment had already passed for resistance, and in that suspended second, the silence I had worn, like a shield, finally became unbearable, because every lie, every maneuver, and every humiliation inflicted in that room pulsed inside my skull with unbearable volume. I felt the pen touch my fingers, and instead of taking it, I closed my hand slowly and lifted my head for the first time with deliberate awareness of every eye resting upon me. When I spoke, my voice did not rise in anger or apology, but landed in the room with calm clarity that shattered the illusion Madison had constructed in a single breath, as I said plainly that I would not be signing anything that ended my authority or erased my name from the company I built. The gasp that moved through the crowd was physical, as if a single lung had expanded beneath the chandelier, and Madison's face drained of color so suddenly that the mask could not recover in time for the cameras. For a heartbeat, the world froze between disbelief and revelation. And then I spoke again louder this time, not for her but for everyone who had gathered to witness what they believed would be my quiet removal. I told them that I could hear them now, not perfectly, not always, but clearly enough to understand every step taken in the shadows to steal my company, and that the silence they had relied upon had betrayed them. The board members shifted as if struck by a current. The journalists leaned forward, and Madison recovered just enough to laugh sharply and accuse me of confusion, of stress, of instability, because that had always been her safest defense for inconvenient truth. I met her gaze and said her name with steady precision, and watched the certainty in her eyes fracture for the first time since the blast. And then I began to speak of timelines and numbers and private conversations that proved my awareness had not returned in confusion but in clarity. I described the provisional support she had secured from the two major shareholders by name, and recited the exit strategies she had rehearsed with them over wine, as if reading from a script only she believed I could never hear. I listened that the room shifted as each detail struck its mark, and when the shareholders attempted to interrupt, I reminded them that silence had been their ally until now, and that they would listen as I had been forced to listen. Madison attempted to move closer, but I stepped away from her for the first time since the explosion and the space between us felt like the falling of a wall. I spoke of the emergency succession language drafted with her attorney and the pressure applied through promises and threats, and I spoke with particular clarity about the private investigator she hired to ensure my containment, as if my freedom were a liability that required surveillance. The air grew heavy with recognition, and when the general, seated near the front, rose slowly to his feet, the authority of his presence shifted the chemistry of the room from spectacle to reckoning. Madison's composure cracked then, not in hysteria, but in cold fury as she accused me of betrayal of deception, of manipulating sympathy, while hiding my recovery for advantage. I accepted the accusation without denial and said that I had pretended because I needed to know who was willing to sacrifice me when they believed I could no longer defend myself, and that the truth of her actions had answered that question completely. I told her that she had spoken of my survival as inconvenience and my death as strategy, and that I had heard those words with the same ears, now hearing the hollow echo of her outrage. The crowd turned visibly at that revelation as the line between rumor and confession disappeared beneath fact and memory. Then I turned toward the wall where Claire stood, trembling beneath the weight of what she believed had doomed her, and I spoke her name gently and watched her fear falter into stunned disbelief. I told the room that she had been accused without evidence and humiliated without cause, because someone needed a scapegoat to complete a public illusion, and that no such lie would stand in my presence. Madison laughed harshly and called it sentiment and disgrace and class blindness, and I answered that the only blindness left in this room was the kind that refused to see loyalty when it wore simple clothing. I walked across the floor toward Claire, and with each step the silence followed me like a receding tide. And when I reached her, I took her hand openly before the crowd that had moments ago accepted her erasure without question. I told them that while contracts shifted and power repositioned behind closed doors, she had spoken only of survival of family and of a man she believed could never hear her, and that in that devotion she had shown more integrity than any alliance formed in that room. Madison tried one final time to assert authority by demanding that security remove me on grounds of medical instability, and for a moment the guards hesitated, uncertain which command still carried weight. Then the general spoke low and unhurried and said that no one would be removed until the truth finished speaking. The power in that sentence settled the room, and Madison stood suddenly alone, stripped not of reputation, yet but of certainty, and for the first time she looked at me not as asset or obstacle, but as danger she had miscalculated. I addressed the board directly then, and withdrew their provisional authority, rescinding every clause signed under deception. And I told them that every vote cast against me, beneath the assumption of permanent silence, would now be subject to immediate review. The press erupted in a storm of motion notes, voices flashing lights. But beneath the chaos, Madison remained immobile, as the future she had rehearsed collapsed out of sequence. I looked at Claire once more and said quietly that I had heard everything she had believed lost to silence, and that no humiliation could erase the truth of what she had given without expectation. Tears moved freely now across her face, and neither of us attempted to hide them beneath the weight of what had finally been spoken. That was the day the deaf man spoke, and in speaking reclaimed not only his name and his power, but the fragile ground on which love had waited in the dark believing it would never be heard. The aftermath unfolded in waves rather than explosions, as truth rarely ends with fire, but with the long, quiet work of consequence and reconstruction. And within days, the press had shifted from scandal to analysis, as Madison's carefully cultivated image began to fracture beneath verified records and corroborated testimony that pulled threads she could no longer conceal. Investigations followed not with the speed of vengeance, but with the steady weight of inevitability, as financial authorities opened reviews into shadow transactions, and political ethics committees examined the channels through which influence had flowed too freely for too long. Madison disappeared first from public appearances, then from boardrooms, then from the narratives she once commanded with ease, and I heard her name spoken with a tone that no longer carried envy but caution, and it was in that shifting echo that I finally felt the past loosen its grip. I stepped away from the front line of Cross Industries, not as a man driven out, but as one who chose distance after returning order to what had been threatened with quiet theft, and the board accepted my decision with a mixture of relief and reverence, as if acknowledging that some empires must be guarded from afar to survive their creators. Power remained within reach, but no longer defined the shape of my days, and in that space something unfamiliar and gentle began to grow. Claire moved through those weeks as if waking from a dream she had never given herself permission to hope beyond, and the world that had once shrunk her into shadows now opened around her with cautious light. She no longer wore the uniform that had marked her silence, though humility never left her posture, and when she spoke, she did so with a steadiness that surprised even herself, as if each word were a new step taken on unfamiliar ground. We spent long afternoons walking along the river without speaking much at first, learning the rhythm of shared presence without duty or fear or secrecy, shaping the distance between us, and in those quiet hours I learned her laughter, not as a hidden trembling sound through walls, but as open music carried freely into the air. She told me about the night her father ran into a burning building without hesitation, and about how the world never quite sounded the same after it fell silent with his absence, and I listened not as a man measuring emotion, but as one finally allowed to receive it without loss. Her mother's health stabilized through proper care, no longer delayed by impossible debts, and her brother stepped into his studies with a future that no longer felt like borrowed time, and each small restoration in their lives echoed within her joy, as if love were not a single bond but a widening circle of return. Madison's legal battles receded into distant headlines, and eventually into quiet footnotes as the world moved forward, in the way it always does, leaving behind even the sharpest dramas for newer storms. And in that letting go, I released the last of the anger that had once kept me vigilant through survival. My hearing never returned completely, but what remained carried clarity enough for honesty and warmth enough for presence. And the doctors called that a miracle measured by percentages, while I measured it instead by the way Claire's voice settled into my heartbeat as naturally as breath. When I asked her to marry me, there were no cameras, no witnesses, no performance, only the soft sound of waves against stone and the tremor in her hands as she answered yes without hesitation this time, because doubt had finally lost its power over her. The wedding came later small and held beneath open sky, where no walls could hide truth and no ceilings could contain it. and the guests were few chosen, not for what they commanded, but for what they had preserved inside us through silence and waiting. I spoke my vows with a voice that once feared it would never rise again, and I spoke them slowly, not for ceremony, but for gratitude, as I promised to hear her even in the spaces where sound fails, and to choose her even when fear returns with old familiar arguments. She answered with tears that did not ask permission, and words that carried neither rehearsal nor armor, only the simple music of a woman stepping fully into her life at last. When she said "I do," the sound felt heavier than applause and softer than prayer, and in that moment I understood that what my hearing had restored was not the world I lost, but the one I had never truly known. We built our life away from spectacle in a coastal town, where power was measured not in contracts, but in tides and mornings unfolded without urgency. And I learned to listen, not for threats, but for the subtle languages of shared meals, quiet laughter, and the steady breathing of a woman sleeping safely beside me. Some nights I still wake to echoes that belong to the past, but they no longer carry command over my present. And when fear stirs, Claire rests her hand against my chest, grounding me in the sound that matters most, the one made by a living heart, choosing another without condition. I lost my hearing once, so I could finally hear what love truly sounds like, not in grand declarations, but in the unguarded spaces where two lives meet without disguise. And when I stand now at the edge of the water, listening to her call my name across the wind, I hear not only her voice, but the full answer to every silence that once defined me. If you stayed with me until this moment, then you did not just listen to a story you walked through. Every silence, every betrayal, every quiet act of love, and every moment where truth waited in the dark to be heard. And now I want to ask you something simple but honest. Did this story make you feel something real, yes or no? Because stories like this are not written only to entertain. They are written to remind us that love does not always arrive loudly. And sometimes the most powerful devotion is the one that waits without being seen. If your heart felt even one beat heavier while listening, then I invite you to write the number 100 in the comments, not for me, but as a signal to yourself that you still believe in love that chooses quietly and stays without demand. And I would truly love to know where you are watching from, because every time I read your countries, your cities, your stories, it reminds me that these emotions connect us far beyond one screen and one voice. Maybe you are listening late at night after a long day. Maybe you are listening in the morning while the world wakes up around you. Or maybe you are somewhere in between, carrying a story of your own that no one else fully knows yet. Wherever you are, I want you to remember, this one truth: love is not proven by how loudly someone claims it, but by how gently they protect it when no one is watching. If this story touched you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, even if they do not know yet that they do, because you never know when a quiet heart needs a reminder that it is still worthy of being chosen. And if you want more stories like this, stories about second chances, about healing, about love that grows in silence and strength, then make sure you subscribe and stay with this channel, because every week we will continue to explore the moments that change lives in ways no one expects. Your support, your comments, and your presence here mean more than numbers. They mean that these stories are not disappearing into silence, but living on through you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for believing even when it is hard to do so.